The last snow of the season came down soft and sideways, the way it does in the Clearwater Mountains when winter is pretending it might stay a little longer. Lydia Kerr stood at the edge of the tree line with her daughter Mabel pressed against her side, both of them looking down into the basin below. It was green. Mabel's hand found Lydia's wrist. "Mama," she said quietly, "it looks like somebody forgot it was still spring." Lydia looked at her daughter, then back at the basin. She had been running for 4 days. Her boots had a split along the left sole that let the cold in. She had $9 and some change, 2 milk goats on lead ropes, a laying hen in a slatted crate strapped to the mule, and a 10-year-old girl who had not complained once. "No," Lydia said. "I think it knows exactly what it's doing." They made their way down through the last of the timber, the goats picking their feet carefully over exposed roots and patches of crusted ice that the tree canopy had preserved in shadow. The mule, whose name was Patience, a name Lydia had given him deliberately and with some irony, descended without incident. Mabel was studying everything. She had her mother's habit of looking at a place the way you might read a page, starting at the edges and working inward. "How does it stay warm?" she asked. "Geothermal spring. The water comes up from deep in the earth where it's warm all the time. It keeps the ground temperature up even when the air is cold." "So it's like the earth is being generous," Mabel said. Lydia stopped walking. That was the kind of thing Mabel said. Observations that arrived sideways and landed harder than intended. In a manner of speaking. Miss Calloway at the schoolhouse in Danner said that most things that look generous have a cost somewhere you can't see yet. Mabel said this without judgment, as a simple reported fact. She wasn't a very cheerful teacher. She wasn't wrong either, Lydia said. But sometimes a thing can be genuinely useful and genuinely available without someone trying to take it away from you. The trick is finding those things before anyone else decides they want them. Mabel thought about this. Is that what we're doing? Finding something before someone else does? That's exactly what we're doing. The real lesson Lydia knew, the one she couldn't quite say aloud yet, was simpler and harder. The only safety that lasts is the kind you build with your own hands, in a place nobody else thought to look. She wasn't ready to tell Mabel that yet, because telling it meant admitting how thoroughly their old life had come apart. But she was beginning to believe it the way you believe in a change of weather. Not because someone told you, but because you can feel it in your joints. The basin was roughly 40 acres of usable ground, shaped like a palm cupped to hold water, with the spring emerging from a limestone shelf on the north wall and dispersing southward across the floor. The surrounding ridges were steep enough to discourage casual passage, but not so sheer as to prevent it. There were 2 natural entries, one from the north through a narrow draw choked with alder, and the one they had come down from the south through the timber. Both entries were inconspicuous. The south entry was marked on no map Lydia had ever seen, and she had spent 3 evenings before leaving their last camp studying the survey plats she'd borrowed, without asking, from the land office records in Danner before she left. The basin had no official claim filed on it. She had checked twice. This was the first piece of luck she had experienced in approximately 14 months. The second piece of luck was the structure she found on the east wall. Not a house exactly, but the solid beginning of one. Someone had set a foundation of fitted stone and raised 2 courses of log walls before abandoning the project. The logs were dry and sound. A partial roof of split shakes covered roughly half the footprint. Whoever had started it had done good work and then simply stopped, which in the Clearwater Mountains usually meant one of 3 things: death, departure, or a change of plan. Lydia didn't particularly care which. She spent the first day assessing. The spring water was cold and clean. The grass was extraordinary, dense and nutritious, the kind of forage that dairy animals thrived on. There was a natural hollow near the spring source that stayed at a near constant temperature, perfect for what she was already beginning to plan. There was timber above for fuel and building. There were no signs of recent human presence, no fire rings, no cut stumps, no wagon ruts. On the second day, she started work. Lydia had grown up on a dairy farm in the Willamette Valley, the middle of 5 children, under a mother who believed that practical knowledge was the only inheritance worth passing down. By the time she was 12, she could make hard cheese, soft cheese, butter, and 3 varieties of cultured cream. By 14, she could assess a goat's milk output, identify common herd ailments, and calculate yield ratios with a pencil stub in under 2 minutes. She had carried this knowledge through a brief, optimistic marriage to Thomas Kerr, through the birth of Mabel, through Thomas's escalating borrowing and his eventual disappearance in the fall of 1888, and through the subsequent discovery that the loan against their Danner property had been made to a man named Creel, who was not a banker, but who behaved like one, specifically the kind of banker who showed up in person each spring to review whether your continued occupancy served his interests. She had received his letter in March. It had been cordial and brief. He expected to discuss the property in May. She understood what discuss meant. She had seen what Creel's discussions looked like when she was still in Danner, the Holloway's place, emptied and locked by June. The widow Prentice, relocated to her sister's in Lewiston before the snow was properly gone. Lydia had packed what mattered: the animals, the cheese-making equipment wrapped in oilcloth, the tools, and Mabel, and left on a Thursday while the mud was still frozen enough to carry weight. She did not leave a note. The log walls needed only modest work to be habitable. She chinked the gaps with a mixture of clay from the spring bank and dry grass, showed Mabel how to test each section for draft by holding a wet finger near the joint, and had a weatherproof single room by the end of the 4th day. She built a shelf system for aging, a Dutch door to keep the animals from wandering in when the bottom half was left open, and a stone-lined trench from the spring to a collection basin near the structure. Mabel helped with everything she was capable of and watched everything she wasn't. The goats, a Toggenburg cross named Alma and a pure Alpine named Rue, adapted immediately, as goats generally do when given exceptional grass and no particular reason for complaint. The hen, whose name was simply the hen because Mabel had not yet settled on something appropriate, began laying on the 3rd day, as if she had been waiting for the right address. By the end of the first week, Lydia had established a milking routine, was aging her first small batch of simple pressed cheese on the stone shelf, and had a fire that she kept to a low, smokeless burn that she vented carefully through a channel she'd built along the north wall. Mabel, for her part, had begun exploring the basin with the systematic intensity of a natural historian. She kept a small notebook in which she recorded the plants she found, the insects, the water temperature at 3 locations along the spring run, and the elevation of the snow line on the south ridge at each morning. She had found, on the 4th day, a colony of wild onions near the spring source, and a patch of watercress that was already lush and ready. She brought both home to her mother like gifts. "We have vegetables," she announced. "We have a start," Lydia agreed. What they did not have was certainty. They had a hidden place and the knowledge to use it, and in Lydia's experience, that was more than most people managed. But the basin was not the world. The world was still out there, and it had Creel in it, and Pine Ledger, the nearest town, was 6 miles through the mountains, close enough to need, far enough to be careful about. The letter arrived 4 weeks after they settled in, which was impossible because no one knew their address, except that it did not arrive by post. Mabel found it wedged under a flat stone at the south entry to the draw, which meant someone had been close enough to leave it without coming in. It was addressed to L. Kerr, in a handwriting she did not recognize. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, were 6 words. "Spring claims file next month. Creel." Not a signature, not a postscript, just those 6 words, like a nail driven cleanly into wood. Lydia read it standing in the south drawer with the morning light coming grey through the alder branches. She read it a second time. She folded it along its original crease and put it in her coat pocket, and stood there for a moment with her hand flat against the paper. Someone knew where they were, or near enough. The letter had found the drawer, which meant the drawer was not as invisible as she had believed. She didn't know if the note was a threat, a warning, or something in between. She didn't know if Creel himself had sent it, or if someone in his network, and Creel had a network, that much she knew from Dana, had tracked their general direction and was narrowing in. What she knew, standing in the cold alder light, was that the plan she had been building, quiet, self-sufficient, invisible, had just acquired a deadline she hadn't set herself. She needed resources she didn't have. She needed a way to acquire them without exposing the basin. And she needed to do it before the spring claims process put Creel in a position to file on ground she was occupying without a proper claim of her own. She walked back to the cabin. Mabel was at the spring with her notebook. "Mama?" Mabel called, not looking up. "The watercress grew another 2 inches overnight. I think the spring temperature is actually increasing as we get deeper into May." "Good," Lydia said. She stood at the cabin door and looked at the basin. The green, the goats, the careful architecture of what she'd built. "We're going to need to be ready for some changes." The debate was not a single conversation. It took place over the better part of a week, mostly inside Lydia's head, sometimes out loud when she was milking and Mabel was out of earshot. Occasionally as a dialogue with herself that she conducted while pressing cheese in the cool of the spring hollow. The first option was to move again. She knew how to do it. The animals were manageable. The equipment was movable. There were other basins in the Clearwater system she hadn't surveyed. The problem was time. A spring claims filing operated on a calendar, and another move would cost her 2 weeks minimum. Plus, she'd be starting from nothing with no aging stock on the shelf and no forage established. She'd have less, not more. The second option was to file a claim herself. She had investigated this possibility while still in Danner, reading the relevant statutes in the land office. A woman could file a homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862 if she were head of household, which Lydia unambiguously was. The problem was the filing required a physical presence at the land office in Lewiston, a 5-day journey, and the moment she filed, the basin's location became a matter of public record. Creel had people in Lewiston. She was nearly certain of it. Filing was announcing. The third option, the one she kept circling back to and then dismissing and then returning to, was to become indispensable. Not visible, not announced, indispensable. The distinction mattered enormously. Visibility meant exposure, and exposure meant Creel could find her and find the basin and have a conversation she wasn't prepared to win directly. But indispensable was different. Indispensable meant that the people in Pine Ledger, the nearest town with a store, a post office, a school, and the assortment of practical needs that a mountain community generated, had a stake in her continued operation. It meant that if Creel came asking, there would be people who found his questions inconvenient. She had the cheese. She had the eggs. She had, increasingly, the butter and the cultured cream. The spring's geothermal warmth meant she was already producing when no one else in the high country could. Her goats were on exceptional pasture weeks before the valley farms below would even be turning animals out. She had a quality advantage and a timing advantage that no one in Pine Ledger could match or replicate quickly. The difficulty was that becoming indispensable required contact, and contact required a route, and a route had to be managed so carefully that it left no trail back to the basin. Mabel had solved part of this problem already, although Lydia had not intended her to. 12 days after they arrived, Lydia had discovered that Mabel had been exchanging handwritten notes with a girl named Dorothea, the daughter of the Pine Ledger dry goods merchant, via a hollow log at the trailhead where the old timber trail intersected the wagon road into town. Mabel had never met Dorothea. She had simply left a note in the log, having found evidence of previous correspondence there from some other party, introducing herself as a girl who lived in the mountains and liked books. Dorothea had replied. They had been corresponding for a week before Lydia found out. Lydia had not been angry exactly. She had been alarmed, and then, as she read through the carefully preserved exchange that Mabel kept folded inside her notebook, she had been struck by something she hadn't anticipated. Mabel's handwriting was exceptional, not merely neat, distinctive. She formed her letters with a slight rightward lean and a particular way of closing her S that was immediately recognizable. And the notes themselves were thoughtful and specific. Mabel had mentioned the watercress, the onions, the spring's early warmth. She had not mentioned their location or their circumstances, but she had mentioned, in passing, that her mother made very good cheese. Dorothea had written back, "My father says proper cheese is impossible to find since Mrs. Whitmore left for Portland. He would pay considerably for good hard cheese if someone nearby made it." Lydia had read this 3 times. She was sitting with the problem of needing to reach Pine Ledger without being traced back to the basin, and Mabel had inadvertently developed a correspondent whose father was a merchant with a stated demand. The hollow log was already a functioning dead drop. The route from the log to town was a known wagon road, not traceable to any specific origin. The risk was real. Notes left at a fixed location could be intercepted or observed. A merchant's sudden interest in a new supplier would attract questions. And Mabel was 10, which meant her judgment, however good, had limits she didn't always know about yet. But the alternative was waiting, and waiting had a deadline attached to it now. Lydia had made most of her significant decisions in life by identifying the option that was least like what she'd done before, and then asking herself whether she was refusing it out of genuine wisdom or out of fear. It was not a comfortable test. It had not always given her the right answer. But it had given her Mabel. And it had given her the basin. And it had a certain discipline to it that she respected. She sat with it through the week, turning it over. She watched the cheese age on the shelf and thought about what she was actually afraid of. And she tried to separate the fears that were information from the fears that were just noise. The fear of exposure was information. The fear of failing Mabel was information. The fear of being seen in general, the reflexive desire to stay small and quiet and unnoticed, that one, she decided, was noise. It was a habit she'd built for protection, and like most protective habits, it was trying to run past its useful life. On the 6th day of this internal argument, she picked up Mabel's notebook, found a clean page, and began writing out the terms of the arrangement she was going to propose to the hollow log. She called Mabel in from the spring and showed her the page. "I'm going to use your correspondence route," she said, "not just with Dorothea, but as a way to reach the merchant directly. We're going to offer cheese, eggs, and butter on a regular basis, traded for specific supplies we need. The notes will go through the hollow log. I'll write them, but they'll be delivered by you when you go to the trailhead to collect Dorothea's letters." Mabel looked at the page, then at her mother. "You're not going to tell me this is too dangerous?" "It has real risks that we're going to manage carefully. No names on the notes except first names. No directions. No references to the spring or the basin. The food goes in a covered pack to the log, picked up by Dorothea's father or someone he sends. Trade goods come back the same way." "What if someone follows Dorothea's father to the log?" "Then we stop immediately and reassess." Lydia looked at her daughter steadily. "But right now, our alternative is waiting for Creel to file on land we're sitting on with no resources to contest it. I prefer to be in motion." Mabel nodded slowly. Then, Can I keep writing to Dorothea separately, just as friends? Yes, Lydia said, but carefully. Mabel held out her hand, and Lydia shook it, which was the way they had always formalized agreements between them, ever since Mabel was 5. Dorothea Marsh was, according to her letters, 11 years old, the eldest of 4, intensely interested in natural history and deeply frustrated by the limited selection of books available at the Pine Ledger School. Her father, she referred to him as father, never by name, was a practical and fair-minded man who had come to Idaho from Minnesota and who believed, Dorothea wrote, that a merchant's reputation is only as good as the quality of goods he carries. Lydia read this and thought, good. What Dorothea wrote about in her own letters was less about commerce and more about the world as she observed it. She had been tracking the return of the meadowlarks to the valley below Pine Ledger and recording the dates. She kept a pressed flower collection that she was organizing by bloom date. She had read all 12 books in the school's lending library and had specific opinions about each of them. Mabel, in her replies, had described the watercress and the wild onions with the precision of her notebook entries, and had mentioned a particular limestone formation near the spring source that she thought looked like a sleeping bear if you approached it from the southeast at morning light. Lydia read both sides of this correspondence and recognized it for what it was, the beginning of a friendship between two unusually observant children who had found each other by accident and were now conducting a mutual scientific exchange. She could not bring herself to curtail it. She added only one rule. Mabel was to review every letter with her before it went into the log, not for censorship, but to practice the habit of reading one's own words as a stranger might. The question to ask, Lydia told her, is, what could someone learn from this that you didn't intend to tell them? Mabel took this seriously. She began revising her letters in draft before finalizing them, a habit that would outlast the basin by decades. The first trade was modest, by design. Lydia sent 2 rounds of pressed hard cheese, each about a pound, a dozen eggs packed in dry grass, and a small crock of cultured butter, totaling what she estimated to be fair trade value for a specific list. 2 pounds of salt, a small quantity of rennet, 2 school primers, and any newspaper not more than 3 weeks old. She wrapped everything in clean cloth and oilcloth, tied it with twine, and placed it in a covered pack that Mabel carried to the hollow log on a Tuesday morning, leaving before first light. Mabel came back 4 hours later with the pack refilled. She set it on the table and stepped back and watched her mother open it. The salt and rennet were there. The primers were there. The newspaper, 2 of them from Lewiston, dated within the month. And one additional item that hadn't been on the list. A small sack of coffee, tied shut with twine, as if someone had guessed what a long spring in the mountains did to a person's morale. There was also a small folded note in an adult hand, precise and economical, that read, "Quality exceptional. Request ongoing weekly supply if available. What else do you make?" Lydia set the note on the table. She looked at it for a long moment. "He liked it," Mabel said. "He liked it very much," Lydia agreed. She picked up the note and looked at the handwriting. Precise, slightly compressed, with a particular formation on the capital W that she found herself studying without knowing why. She set it down and began calculating what weekly production the basin could support. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Lydia had experienced in longer than she cared to calculate, and she was aware, in a part of her mind she kept for honest accounting, that this was both wonderful and worth being careful about. Good periods had a way of making a person complacent, and complacency was a luxury she couldn't afford. But they were good weeks nonetheless. The system worked. Mabel made the trailhead walk on Tuesdays and Fridays, departing before dawn and returning by mid-morning. The load went one way. Supplies came back. Lydia managed the production, and Mabel managed the correspondence, and between them, they developed a set of practices that balanced efficiency against security, with the kind of natural collaboration that comes when two people have been through enough together to trust each other's judgment without much discussion. The cheese operation expanded quickly because the basin allowed it. The spring kept the temperature in the hollow consistent at approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Mabel had verified this with the small thermometer from their kit, which was nearly ideal for aging pressed cheese. Lydia could produce two varieties: a simple fresh cheese that was ready in 3 days, made from whole milk with a small amount of the cultured butter's bacteria as a starter, and a pressed hard cheese that benefited from 2 to 4 weeks of aging and emerged from the hollow with a golden rind and a flavor that she thought, without vanity, was genuinely exceptional. The fresh cheese was popular first because it arrived in spring, when the valley farms below Pine Ledger were still weeks from turning their dairy cattle out, and the nearest reliable supply was the canned and processed imports that came up from Lewiston. Dorothea's father, Lydia had learned from the notes that his name was Mr. Marsh, had been selling a canned condensed product that his customers tolerated but did not prefer. The fresh cheese was categorically better and arrived in his stock like a surprise, and he moved the first 2 weeks' worth in 2 days. The hard cheese arrived on the market 3 weeks in, once Lydia had enough aging stock to begin releasing rounds, and it moved even faster. Mr. Marsh sent a note. The notes were now a regular feature of the exchange, always brief and factual, always in the same compressed handwriting, saying that he had sold the first 4 rounds before they were properly shelved, and that he had customers asking specifically for what he had begun calling mountain cheese in his informal stock descriptions. He had not asked her name again after the first note. He had not asked for a meeting. He operated the exchange with a discretion that Lydia found both useful and slightly puzzling. Most merchants she dealt with were intensely interested in the provenance of their goods, both for their own assurance and for the marketing potential. Mr. Marsh seemed content to know only what the food itself told him, which was that it was made with skill and care in conditions that produced quality. This discretion meant, she supposed, that he either respected her obvious preference for privacy or that he was gathering information through other means. She kept the second possibility in mind without letting it dominate her thinking. The eggs were a reliable secondary income. The hen, Mabel had eventually settled on Juniper as an official name, citing the color of her eggs' yolks, though Lydia continued to think of her privately as the hen, was producing reliably, and Lydia had, in the 3rd week of trading, acquired 2 additional hens via trade, along with a small quantity of grain that she rationed carefully. 3 hens on exceptional spring forage produced more eggs than she'd expected, and eggs were smaller and more easily concealed in the packs than cheese. The butter, which she'd initially offered almost as an afterthought, turned out to be the most aggressively demanded item on the informal menu. The Toggenburg Alpine Cross milk that came from Alma and Rue had a fat content that produced a butter of unusual richness, and the cultured method Lydia used, letting the cream ripen slightly before churning, a technique her mother had taught her, gave it a depth of flavor that, according to one of Mr. Marsh's notes, had caused his wife to make a specific inquiry about the source. "My wife asks if the butter is European style," the note said. "I have told her it is local. She says she does not care where it is from, so long as it keeps coming." Lydia had smiled at this. She wrote back, "It is local. It will keep coming as long as conditions allow." She had not explained what conditions meant. She understood that Mr. Marsh might be curious about the phrase, and she allowed it to sit there as a gentle reminder that the arrangement was, at her end, contingent on circumstances she controlled. The supplies that came back through the hollow log were carefully chosen on her side, and, she noted, thoughtfully sourced on his. He had begun adding small extras without comment. A packet of vegetable seeds that were not on her list, but that he had presumably deduced would be useful. A small book on regional wildflowers that Mabel immediately claimed as her own. A length of oilcloth, better than the worn piece she'd mentioned needing. He was attentive, she thought, in the way that genuinely good merchants were. He was not just filling orders, but learning what his supplier needed. This was either a professional habit or something more considered. She was not yet sure. Mabel, meanwhile, was conducting her own parallel operation with a completeness that Lydia found both impressive and characteristic. Her twice-weekly correspondence with Dorothea had expanded in scope and frequency. The Tuesday and Friday walks meant that letters could be exchanged regularly, and the two girls had developed what Mabel described as a mutual scientific project, which turned out to be a comparative phenology study. Mabel recording bloom dates and temperature fluctuations at the basin, Dorothea recording the same data from the valley near Pine Ledger, so that they could map the elevation differential's effect on seasonal timing. This was, Lydia noted, a genuinely interesting scientific project. She did not say this to Mabel because she thought Mabel already knew it and did not need the validation. But she read both sides of the phenology correspondence with real interest. The data was showing what she had suspected from the day she arrived. The basin's thermal spring advanced its season by approximately 3 to 4 weeks relative to Pine Ledger's elevation, which was itself in the foothills. The basin was operating in late May as though it were late June. This was the core advantage of the whole enterprise, and seeing it quantified in Mabel's careful columns made it feel more real, somehow. Not just a stroke of luck, but an actual, documented, reproducible characteristic. In the 5th week of trading, she received a note from Mr. Marsh that was slightly longer than usual. He had begun, he wrote, receiving inquiries from customers about whether the mountain cheese and butter would be available through the summer, and he had told them he expected so. He had also received, entirely separately and without apparent connection, a visit from a man asking general questions about the basin country above Pine Ledger, whether there were any active claims in the higher elevations, whether anyone was known to be operating in that area. I have mentioned nothing of our arrangement, the note said. I do not know the man's business. I mention it only so that you are informed. Lydia read this twice. She set it down and looked at the basin, the green, the goats on the far side near the spring source, Mabel's distant figure crouched over something at the water's edge. The note was the kind of note a trustworthy person writes. It was also the kind of note a person writes when they want to signal trustworthiness in a way that is both genuine and useful to their own interests. She had decided early on that she did not need Mr. Marsh to be purely altruistic. She needed him to be reliably in the situation where helping her was also helping himself. A merchant who had built a reputation around a product he could only get through one supplier had a structural incentive to protect that supplier's ability to operate. She wrote back, "Thank you for the information. The arrangement is not affected. Please do not provide information about our exchange to visitors with questions." His reply came back with Mabel's next walk. "Understood. I have not and will not." She felt a slight loosening of something she'd been holding tight for weeks. Not trust, not quite, but the beginning of confidence in an arrangement. She used the extra mental space this created to begin working on the problem of the claim. The filing required a visit to Lewiston. She had been turning over alternatives and had not found any that fully satisfied her. Filing by proxy was possible, but involved disclosing the basin's existence to a legal representative she didn't know. Filing under a different name was not legal, and was the kind of solution that created worse problems than it solved. Going in person was the cleanest option, but also the most exposed. She was beginning to think she needed a piece of information before she could act. Whether Creel had actually begun a claims inquiry, and on what specific ground. The letter at the draw had mentioned a spring claims file, but Creel was not above using the impression of official process to pressure people who might not know the actual rules. She needed to know whether she was facing a real filing deadline or a manufactured one. Getting that information meant someone in Lewiston or someone who went regularly to Lewiston. Mr. Marsh, she happened to know from the notes, made a supply run to Lewiston each month. She sat with this for a day before writing the note. "I have a question outside our usual exchange. Would you be willing to make a quiet inquiry at the Lewiston Land Office, whether any spring claims inquiries have been filed for unimproved high basin land in the Clearwater system north of Pine Ledger? I ask only for information, not action. I understand if this is beyond what you consider appropriate for our arrangement." His reply came in 2 days, which was faster than usual, indicating he had made the inquiry on his next available trip rather than waiting. No filings currently in process for that area. One inquiry logged approximately 6 weeks ago, a name I won't write here, but whose initial is C, requesting information on the claims process for basin land above 4,500 feet. No formal action taken. The land office clerk noted the inquiry seemed primarily concerned with whether occupied land without a formal claim was vulnerable. I am told the answer given was yes in certain circumstances. Lydia sat with this information for a long time. It confirmed the threat was real. It also confirmed that Creel had not yet filed, which meant she had time, but not unlimited time. He was testing the process, learning the rules. He would move when he understood that the window was right. She needed to file before he did. But filing required visibility. What she was turning over now was whether the thing that had felt like her greatest vulnerability, her established, working, traded upon presence in the basin, was actually her greatest asset. She had suppliers who depended on her. She had a product that had become a feature of Pine Ledger's market. She was not invisible, but she was valued. That was a different kind of protection than invisibility. It was noisier and more exposed, but it was the kind that grew rather than the kind that shrank. She began that week to make a different kind of cheese, not for trading, for introducing. It was a semi-hard variety she'd made only occasionally, flavored with the wild onions from the spring bank and a small addition of dried herbs she'd gathered on the south slope. It was, she thought, the best thing she made. Distinctive, clearly local, clearly skilled. The kind of product that represented a real place and a real person rather than a generic dairy commodity. She aged the first batch for 2 weeks before sending it to Mr. Marsh with a note. This is a new variety. It is not for general stock. Please offer 1 round to the person in town who, in your judgment, most needs to understand that the mountain dairy operation above Pine Ledger is a real and established enterprise. I leave the choice to you. His reply was brief. Understood. I have someone in mind. She did not ask who. She had decided to trust his judgment on this particular move, and having decided that, she found it simpler to follow through rather than second-guess it. Decisions benefited from commitment the way cheese benefited from consistent temperature. She made 3 more rounds of the onion herb variety and put them in the aging hollow. Mabel, watching all of this with her systematic attention, asked one evening, "Are we still hiding?" Lydia thought about this. "We're still careful. That's not the same thing. But we're more visible than we were. We're more valuable than we were. That changes what visibility means." Mabel wrote something in her notebook. Lydia didn't ask what. The basin was in full early summer condition now, which was to say it looked the way the valley below Pine Ledger would look in 6 or 7 weeks. The grass was lush and heavy. The spring ran clear and steady. The goats were in peak production. The aging shelf held 12 rounds in various stages of maturity. The hens were laying 3 to 4 eggs per day. Lydia stood at the spring source one evening and tried to count what she had built in 6 weeks. A functional dairy, a working trade relationship, a network of information, a strategy that was still uncertain but was active and forward-moving rather than passive and waiting. She had come here with $9 and some change. The hollow log was in a sense her bank now. She had accumulated, in trade goods and their cash equivalents, approximately $60 worth of supplies and materials, with outstanding credit held informally in Mr. Marsh's stock. It was not security by any conventional measure, but it was more than she'd had, and it was built from something real. The new postmaster arrived in Pine Ledger on a Friday, which was how Lydia learned about it. Mabel came back from the hollow log with the week's trade goods and the regular note from Mr. Marsh. And at the bottom of his note, below the supply acknowledgement and the single inquiry about whether she could supply fresh, soft cheese in addition to hard, was a sentence that had not appeared in his notes before. The Territory has sent a new postmaster. His name is Mr. Eldis Cole. He began this week. She read it twice, as she read everything twice. The addition of a postmaster to the town's roster was not by itself alarming. Pine Ledger had presumably needed one. What Mr. Marsh was telling her, by including it without explanation, was that he thought she should know. He had, in 6 weeks of notes, never included information he thought was irrelevant. She had been sending trade notes in her own handwriting since the beginning. She had not thought much about this because the notes went to the hollow log and then to Mr. Marsh, not through any postal channel. But a postmaster was a person who processed written communications and, more importantly, was often a person with a specific interest in and ability to read handwriting. For the straightforward purpose of deciphering difficult addresses, but also, sometimes, for less straightforward purposes. She looked at her notes. She thought about Mabel's letters to Dorothea, which also went through the hollow log and were sometimes passed along via Mr. Marsh's deliveries when Dorothea was not able to collect in person. She thought about Mabel's distinctive handwriting, the rightward lean, the closed ES. She thought about what a careful, attentive new postmaster, interested in understanding his community, might make of a recurring correspondence arriving through an unusual channel, in 2 distinctive hands, concerning a mountain dairy operation with no named owner and no known address. She was not alarmed, but she was sharpened, in the way that information sharpens you when it arrives cleanly before the problem fully develops. This was the moment when the world outside the basin reminded her that it was paying attention, even if she couldn't yet see who was watching or with what intent. She picked up her pen and began a note to Mr. Marsh, not about the postmaster, but about the soft cheese request. She would address the other thing when she knew more. For now, she knew that the next phase was beginning. The summer settled into the basin with the gentle authority of something that intends to stay. The days lengthened and the spring ran on, keeping the hollow at its constant cool 52. And the goats worked the extraordinary grass with the dedicated efficiency of animals that have found exactly the conditions they were built for. By late June, the operation had a rhythm that felt almost domestic, almost ordinary, if you did not think too carefully about what was behind it. Lydia thought carefully about what was behind it. That was the job. The first indication that things were shifting came from Mabel, who had a gift for noticing small changes in the notes from Dorothea, the way some people notice changes in the weather. not from a single sign, but from a constellation of minor adjustments in tone and word choice. "Dorothea seems nervous," Mabel said one morning, sitting with the latest letter. "What makes you think so?" "She writes shorter sentences when she's nervous. Usually, her sentences are long because she has a lot to say and she doesn't like to stop. These are short." Mabel showed the letter to Lydia. "See? 4 sentences that could have been 1. Lydia read the letter. Dorothea had described the latest phenology data. Bloom dates on the valley side were running exactly as the girl's model predicted, and had asked, briefly, whether Mabel might know if the mountain dairy's owner would be open to a meeting. She had framed it as a casual question, but it was not a casual question, and the short sentences around it confirmed that she had been asked to write it by someone and was uncomfortable with the commission. Did she say by whom? No, but she says her father asked her to pass the message. Lydia set the letter on the table. Mr. Marsh had requested a meeting. He had chosen to make the request through Dorothea's letter to Mabel rather than through his own trade notes, which meant, she thought, that he considered it a personal request rather than a commercial one, and possibly that he was being circumspect about leaving a written record of the request in channels he was less certain about. She was not against a meeting. She had been considering how one might be arranged safely for some time, but the timing, coming alongside the information about the new postmaster, required examination. She wrote back to Dorothea through Mabel. "Please tell your father that a meeting may be possible. He should leave a note in the usual channel with the proposed time and place of his choosing. The decision about whether that location feels appropriate will be made separately." The reply came within 48 hours. Mr. Marsh proposed a meeting at the trailhead where the old timber trail met the wagon road, the same place where the hollow log stood. He suggested a Tuesday morning, early, before the road saw regular traffic. He wrote that he would come alone. Lydia approved the location because she knew it and because there were 3 exits from it that she had walked. She approved the time because it was a period she'd already observed was genuinely quiet. She approved his commitment to come alone because she had no way to enforce it, but believed him capable of keeping such a commitment. She wrote back, "Tuesday, the time you suggest. I will not be difficult to identify. I am told the butter speaks for itself." She had not intended this as a joke, exactly, but Mr. Marsh apparently took it as one. His reply contained the phrase, "I shall follow my nose," which was the most informal thing he had written in the entire correspondence, and which told her something about the man before she met him. She spent the days before the meeting continuing to work and continuing to think. The second indicator of something changing was the note she found at the south drawer entry. Not from Creel this time, but in a different hand, shorter and less deliberate, wedged in the same location as the first one. "Heard there's a woman living in the high basin with animals. Is that right? Just friendly curiosity." The note was unsigned. It was clearly not from Creel. The phrasing was too casual, the handwriting different. But it had found the same entry point as Creel's note, which meant the path was known. Not just known, used by more than one person. She considered the implications. The draw was a natural entry route for anyone approaching from the south, and she had left no marks on it. But the path itself, if someone followed the wagon road off-branch, was logical. She had been treating the draw as invisible because she did not mark it. But it was not invisible. It was merely unmarked. Those were different. She moved her morning departure point to the north entry, through the alder choke, which was harder but less obvious. She added a string of natural-looking downed branches across the south draw. Not a barrier exactly, but a small discouragement, the kind of thing that looked accidental and made a person feel, obscurely, that there was nothing much down that way. She also started keeping a daily record of any marks in the south draw, boot prints, disturbances in the leaf litter, so that she would know if the path was being walked with any frequency. The Tuesday meeting arrived. Lydia left Mabel at the basin with instructions, a reading assignment from the primers, and a simple task. Note the time of departure and her expected return. And if the return was more than 2 hours late, take both goats to the north draw entry and wait there until dark. Mabel accepted this instruction with the gravity she gave to all instructions that had real stakes in them. If you're more than 2 hours late, Mabel said, should I worry? You should be practical, Lydia said. Those are different things. She took the north path and came around to the trailhead from the east, approaching the hollow log from the timber side rather than the road. She arrived 20 minutes early and stood in the trees and watched the trailhead for the full 20 minutes before the meeting time. He arrived on foot, as promised, coming up the wagon road from the direction of town with a deliberate walk that was neither hurried nor casual. A walking with purpose that she recognized as a person who had decided to do something and was doing it. He was perhaps 45, of medium build, with the kind of weathered face that outdoor life in Idaho produces, and he wore a good coat that was clean but not new. He stopped at the hollow log, took out a pocket watch, looked at it, and then stood and looked at the trees in a manner that was not quite searching, more like an acknowledgement that he understood someone might be watching. She stepped out of the timber. He turned at the sound of her movement and waited while she covered the distance between them. He did not extend his hand first, which she appreciated, a courtesy to her right to set the terms of the interaction. She extended her hand. He shook it. Mr. Marsh. Mrs. Kerr. He said it without flourish. He knew her name. The notes had contained it in fragments across multiple exchanges, enough to reconstruct. I appreciate your discretion, she said. I appreciate your cheese, he said. This was clearly a prepared remark that had come out better than he'd intended, because he followed it immediately with a slightly wry expression. That was meant to be more businesslike than it sounded. It was clear enough. They spoke for 30 minutes at the trailhead, standing rather than sitting, in the manner of a conversation that was not entirely decided whether it was a meeting or an encounter. He was direct and specific. He had been selling her products for 6 weeks and had, he said, become increasingly aware that the operation he was dealing with was more substantial and skilled than the informal arrangement suggested, and that his growing dependence on the supply for his customers' satisfaction created a mutual interest in the operation's stability. He had heard about Creel, not from her, from two other sources, one of whom was the new postmaster, a Mr. Aldous Cole, who had arrived in Pine Ledger with what Mr. Marsh described as a remarkable memory for correspondence and a particular interest in understanding where goods in the community came from. "He is not a harmful person," Mr. Marsh said carefully, "but he is thorough. He has been asking questions that I believe are motivated by genuine curiosity rather than anything more pointed. But he is the kind of person who, once curious, tends toward completeness." "What questions?" "He received a package from Lewiston containing a request from an unnamed party, but described in a way that makes me fairly confident of the source, asking him to flag any correspondence originating from or referring to high basin activity north of Pine Ledger." Mr. Marsh looked at her steadily. "He showed me the request because I am on the town committee and he thought it was my concern. I have not told him anything about our arrangement." Lydia stood with this. "He showed you the request." "He did." "And he's been pursuing it?" "He has been observing. He mentioned the handwriting on certain notes he had seen in general circulation as being distinctive." There it was. She had known it was coming from the moment Mr. Marsh had written about the new postmaster's arrival. It was the thing she had not been able to avoid. Mabel's handwriting, present in Dorothea's correspondence, potentially visible in secondary circulation. The letters between the girls had traveled through channels that included hand delivery by Mr. Marsh's delivery man, and a delivery man who brought packages to the postmaster occasionally would have had occasion to set things down, and a postmaster with a good eye would have noticed. She thought about what she had built, the cheese operation, the trade network, Mr. Marsh's discretion, the basin itself. She thought about what was at risk. She also thought about what she had said to Mabel weeks ago. The only safety that lasts is the kind you build with your own hands, in a place nobody else thought to look. The place had been found. Not by Creel, not yet, but by the slow process of a community noticing a presence it could not fully account for. This was, she realized, not a failure of the plan, but a natural consequence of the plan's success. She had become indispensable. Indispensable things get noticed. The question was what she intended to do with being noticed. "What do you want from this meeting?" she asked Mr. Marsh directly. "I want to help you stabilize the situation," he said. "Not out of charity, though I hope you'll believe I'm not indifferent to your circumstances, but because I have 20 customers who are now expecting mountain cheese and butter, and because I believe you are a person of considerable competence who is in a situation that requires resources you don't currently have access to." "What resources are you proposing?" "The land claim," he said. "If you file through the land office in Lewiston, the record becomes public and Creel becomes aware of your location. But there is a provision. I had a lawyer friend look at this after your inquiry about the claims process came back to me. For a homestead claim to be filed by a representative with a notarized statement from the claimant, the claimant's current address does not have to be included in the filing. Only the claimant's identity and the legal description of the parcel." Lydia looked at him. "The legal description of the parcel identifies the location." It identifies the parcel, yes, but a legal description is coordinates and boundaries. It does not appear on any general map. A person would have to specifically search the filing to find it, and to search the filing, they would need to know to search. He paused. Creel's inquiry at the land office was general, basing land above 4,500 feet. A specific filing under a specific claim number is a different search from a general area inquiry. They would have to know to look. You've thought about this carefully. I have a stake in the outcome, he said simply. She studied the middle distance for a moment, running the logic. It was not a perfect solution, nothing in this territory was, but it was a real one. It would require trusting him with the formal process, which was a significant thing. But she had been trusting him with her livelihood for 6 weeks, and he had not given her any reason to regret it. The postmaster, she said, Mr. Cole. What is your assessment of him as a person? Mr. Marsh thought for a moment. Thorough and fair. He is doing what was asked of him, but I do not think he would act to harm a family if he understood the circumstances. He paused again. He has a daughter of his own, about 10, I believe. The mention of a daughter was not, she thought, an accident. Mr. Marsh was a careful communicator. I need to think, she said. Give me 4 days. Of course. One more question. The note at my south entry, the unsigned one asking if a woman was living in the high basin. Was that from you or from Mr. Cole? He looked briefly surprised. Not that she'd received the note, but that she'd identified it as originating from one of 2 people. That was Mr. Cole, he said. He asked me if I knew of such a woman, and I told him I did not. And then I believe he sent the note himself, through a channel he'd identified from the pattern of deliveries. He has not received a reply. He won't, she said. She stepped back toward the tree line. 4 days, Mr. Marsh, the usual channel. 4 days, he agreed. She went back through the timber and back around to the north draw and descended into the basin, where Mabel was sitting at the spring with her notebook and both goats grazing nearby, exactly as she should have been. You're back, Mabel said, without looking up. I am, Lydia said. How's the water temperature? 52.4, Mabel looked up. How was the meeting? Informative. We have some decisions to make. Good or bad decisions? The only kind, Lydia said. The kind that are both. The letter from Creel arrived 2 days later. Not at the south draw this time, but at the hollow log. Mabel found it among the usual trade goods, with no explanation of how it had come to be there. It was longer than the first. It had been sent, by the dating on it, 3 weeks prior, which meant it had traveled through the postal system to the Pine Ledger post office and had been held or handled there before reaching the log. The new postmaster had received it. He had put it in the distribution channel it was addressed to, the hollow log exchange point, which meant Mr. Cole had been watching the log closely enough to know it functioned as a mail channel. The letter was addressed to Mrs. L. Kerr, Mountain Basin, Clearwater Country, care of the Pine Ledger Community Channel, as if the route were a normal address. An informal system Creel had evidently identified well enough to use. Even Creel's handwriting on the envelope was deliberate and unhurried. Inside, he wrote that he had engaged a land claims agent who would be filing a formal claim inquiry on high basin land north of Pine Ledger in 21 days. He wrote that any current occupants of such land would have exactly that period in which to either vacate or demonstrate a prior valid claim. He wrote that he had no wish to make this unpleasant for anyone, but that he had held the original debt obligation for 3 years now, and that the matter required resolution. He wrote at the end, "I am aware you have established a productive operation in the basin, and I respect the work involved. This is not personal. It is a matter of the obligation your husband undertook, which has come to you by inheritance of his affairs." Lydia sat with the letter in her lap and looked at the basin. The green of it, the spring running bright, the goats, the cheese on the shelf, Mabel's measured voice from outside somewhere, reading aloud to herself from one of the primers. 21 days from the date of the letter. Put the deadline 8 days from today. She had known this was coming. She had been preparing for it. She had the structure of a response half built in her mind. But holding the letter and reading Creel's confident, reasonable prose, she felt something settle through her like cold water. Not despair exactly, but the weight of what it would mean to fail. Not just for her, but for Mabel. Not just for their present circumstances, but for all the careful, practical, skilled work of the 6 weeks past, which had been real and good and hers, and which could be erased by a filing deadline as easily as a chalk mark off a board. She did not move for a long time. Then she folded the letter, placed it in her coat, and stood up. She did not sleep well that night. The sleep she got was thin and interrupted, which was unusual for her. She was not given to sleeplessness, even in difficult periods. What kept her awake was not the fear precisely. It was the question she'd been holding at arm's length since the beginning. Whether she had been building towards something or merely delaying the inevitable. The basin was real. The operation was real. The relationships she'd established were real. But real things could still be overcome by a legal process and a man with the money to pursue it. And she was not naive about the relationship between resources and outcomes in a territorial land office. She lay in the dark and went through the facts. The claim filing would succeed if she did nothing. The claim filing would fail if she had a prior valid claim on record. She could file a prior valid claim if she could reach the Lewiston Land Office with the right documentation in the next 8 days. 8 days was feasible, barely, if she had help with the documentation and did not have to make the journey alone. Mr. Marsh had offered help. She had been holding the offer at a careful distance, examining it, looking for the place where it cost her something she wasn't willing to pay. She thought about this for a long time in the dark. What did accepting his help actually cost her? It cost her the full independence of her position, which was already partly fictional. She had been trading with him for 6 weeks, which was already a form of mutual dependence. It exposed the formal legal existence of the basin's claim to a person who already knew its location and character. It required trusting a person she had known for 6 weeks through written notes and one 30-minute meeting. She thought about the meeting. She thought about the way he had stood at the trailhead, not searching exactly, but acknowledging. The way he had said, "I have a stake in the outcome," without pretending it was charity. The way he had mentioned his daughter, quietly, as a piece of relevant information rather than a tool of persuasion. She thought about Mabel, asleep on the far side of the cabin, the notebook on the shelf beside her, the pressed flowers at the back of it, between the pages, because Mabel had adopted the habit from Dorothea without mentioning it. She thought about what she had told Mabel at the beginning. Sometimes a thing can be genuinely useful and genuinely available without someone trying to take it away from you. The trick is finding those things before anyone else decides they want them. Mr. Marsh had not tried to take anything. He had repeatedly offered something. And the thing she was trying to hold on to, the idea that full independence was possible, that she could operate in complete self-sufficiency without reliance on anyone else's goodwill or structural interests, was not a principle. It was a habit she'd built to cope with the specific harm of Thomas Kerr and Creel and the chain of events that had followed. It was a habit that had kept her moving and kept her safe. But habits that were built for one set of circumstances did not always serve in a different set. And she was honest enough, in the small hours of that sleepless night, to examine whether she was holding the habit because it was wise or because it was familiar. The basin was not something she could protect alone. The cheese was not something she could eat alone. Mabel was not something she was raising alone. There was Dorothea's correspondence and the school books and the intellectual community of two young natural historians sharing data across an elevation gradient, and none of that was solitary. She had been building a community and trying to pretend she was doing it alone, because community implied obligation, and obligation implied vulnerability, and vulnerability was the thing she'd been running from since March. But vulnerability was also, she understood in the dark, the price of being real. Things that had no stake in anything were also things that could be walked away from. She did not want to be something that could be walked away from. Not by Mabel, not by the town she was beginning to be part of, not by herself. She sat up. She lit the small oil lamp. She found her pen and a clean sheet of paper and began to write. She wrote 2 notes before dawn. The first was to Mr. Marsh through the hollow log. It read, "I am ready to act on your suggestion regarding the land claim filing. I will need the lawyer's name and whatever documentation you can prepare. I have 8 days from today. Please advise on what is needed from me and what you can manage from your end." The second note was different. It was addressed to Mr. Aldous Cole, care of the Pine Ledger Post Office, and she wrote it in her own handwriting, clearly and without concealment. It read, "Mr. Cole, I believe you have been wondering about the mountain basin operation north of town, and about the handwriting on certain notes that have come through community channels. I would like to meet with you at your convenience in Pine Ledger at a time of your choosing. I am not hiding from you. I am a woman filing a homestead claim on land I have worked and improved in good faith. I believe you are a fair person. I would prefer to tell you that directly than to have you continue wondering. My name is Lydia Kerr." She sealed both notes and put them in the pack for the morning's delivery. She woke Mabel at first light and told her everything. Mabel listened with the serious, complete attention she gave to things that mattered. "So we're not hiding anymore," Mabel said. "We never were quite," Lydia said. "Now we're choosing not to be." Mabel nodded slowly. "Can I write to Dorothea and tell her I'm coming to town?" "Yes," Lydia said. "I think it's time." The 8 days that followed were the most active period of Lydia's life since the week she'd built the cabin, and they had a different quality to them, less solitary, more orchestrated, with moving parts that required trust in other people's execution. Mr. Marsh's reply arrived within a day of her note. His lawyer friend, a Mr. Eustace Tolliver, operated in Lewiston and was available. Mr. Marsh had already spoken to him provisionally. What Tolliver needed was a notarized statement from Lydia attesting to her identity, her status as head of household, and the fact of her continuous occupancy of the land. Notarization required a notary, which Pine Ledger had in the person of the school teacher, a Mr. Abernathy, who held a territorial notary commission as a secondary function of his position. Lydia would need to come to Pine Ledger to get the notarization. There was no avoiding it. She came on a Wednesday. She had not been to a town in 2 months. She had, in a sense, been preparing herself for this moment since the hollow log meeting with Mr. Marsh. But standing on the Pine Ledger Main Street with Mabel beside her, she felt the weight of being visible in a public place, with her actual name attached to her actual self. It was not comfortable. But it was real, and she had decided that real was what she was going to be. Mr. Marsh met them at the street entrance to his store. He was much as she'd expected from the meeting, steady, direct, not unkind. He greeted Mabel with the specific courtesy adults extend to children who have been previously represented to them as capable, which Mabel received with characteristic gravity. "Your correspondence partner is inside," he said to Mabel. "She has been asking about you since 6 this morning." Mabel looked at her mother. Lydia nodded. Mabel walked into the store with the composure of someone who had been looking forward to something for a long time and did not intend to let it show by hurrying. Mr. Marsh watched her go. "She's remarkable," he said. "She knows it," Lydia said, "which is why I don't tell her." He almost smiled at this. "Mr. Abernathy is at the schoolhouse. He's expecting you. I've explained the situation generally." He paused. "And Mr. Cole has asked if he might speak with you after the notarization." "I know," Lydia said. "I wrote to him." This surprised him. She could see it, a slight recalibration in his expression, the recognition that she had moved ahead of where he'd expected her to be. "He'll be fair," Mr. Marsh said. "I know," she said again. Mr. Abernathy, the schoolteacher, was a thin, careful man of middle age who took the notary function seriously and executed it with precision. He read her statement twice, checked her identification. She had her marriage certificate and Mabel's birth record, which together established her identity and household status clearly, and notarized the document with the unhurried efficiency of a person who had performed official functions long enough to be neither overimpressed nor under-careful. He looked at her over his glasses when they were finished. "You're the Mountain Dairy," he said. It was not a question. "I am." "My students have been asking about the cheese since Dorothea Marsh first brought some to share at lunch." He gathered his notary materials. They wanted to know who made it. I told them I didn't know. I suppose now I do. I hope it was satisfactory. The cheese was exceptional, he said, and your daughter's penmanship, which I've reviewed through Dorothea's letters, is the best I've seen in a student her age. He said this last thing with the careful precision of a man who means to compliment but does not want to presume. If she were to attend school in Pine Ledger, I would consider it a genuine addition to the class. Lydia looked at him. She reads well above her level. She would need the advanced materials. I would find them, he said. They looked at each other for a moment across the desk. Two people who had not met before, but who had arrived at the same conversation by parallel routes, and who recognized in each other a similar approach to the specific problem of education. That's a matter for the future, Lydia said. For now, there's the claim filing. Of course. He handed her the notarized document. Good luck, Mrs. Kerr. Mr. Aldous Cole was waiting outside the post office when she walked past it. He was a compact, precise-looking man of about 50, with very good posture and the kind of attentive stillness that characterized people who had spent their professional lives reading and processing information. He had, she noted, a ledger tucked under one arm and an expression that was politely neutral in the way that people are politely neutral when they are actually quite curious. He raised his hat. Mrs. Kerr. Mr. Cole. I appreciate you writing to me. He was direct about this, not effusive, just clear. I had been wondering. I know, she said. I thought it was better to address it directly than to have you continue wondering in a way that might become inconvenient for both of us. He looked at her with what she thought was a brief, honest appreciation for the precision of this. I received a request from a party in Lewiston to flag correspondence from the basin area, he said. I want to be transparent about that. I know about that as well, she said. I want you to know that I have not forwarded any information in response to that request. I'm not sure it would be appropriate. He turned the ledger in his hands once. The request came with no official standing. It was a private inquiry dressed in the style of an official one. I've been in postal service long enough to recognize the difference. Lydia looked at him carefully. You've been building toward telling me that. I have been deciding whether it was appropriate to tell you, he said. I've decided it is, because the circumstances seem to warrant it. He paused. I have a daughter who is 9. She corresponds with a girl in town, here, now, which is a different kind of correspondence than before, but she takes it seriously. I understand something about the way children's correspondence can carry information that was not quite meant to be sent. He stopped. I'm explaining more than I should. No, Lydia said. You're explaining exactly enough. He nodded. Is there anything you need from the post office's formal functions? I'm filing a homestead claim through an agent in Lewiston, she said. I expect there will be official correspondence through your office once it's filed. I would appreciate knowing when it arrives. You'll know when it arrives, he said simply. She extended her hand. He shook it. She went back to Mr. Marsh's store, where she found Mabel and Dorothea at a table by the back window, surrounded by Mabel's notebook and Dorothea's pressed flower collection, deep in a discussion that neither of them looked up from when Lydia entered. Mr. Marsh was behind the counter. He raised his eyebrows in inquiry. "The notarization is done," she said. "Mr. Cole and I have spoken." She set the notarized document on the counter. "What do I need to do to get this to Mr. Tolliver in Lewiston by Thursday?" "I'm sending a supply wagon Thursday morning," he said. "My delivery man knows Tolliver's office. He'll take it directly." "And the filing timeline?" "Tolliver says the claim can be in the land office records by end of next week, with priority dating from today's notarization." Creel's deadline was 8 days. The filing would be in before the deadline. Not by much, but before. "What's Tolliver's fee?" she asked. "I've paid it," Mr. Marsh said. "On account." She looked at him. "You can repay it in hard cheese over the next quarter," he said. "I've been undersupplied for 2 weeks, and my customers are asking pointed questions." She thought about the independence she'd been protecting and the community she'd been building, and how they were not, after all, opposites of each other. They were the same project, seen from different directions. "Done," she said. She looked toward the back window. Mabel was showing Dorothea something in the notebook, pointing at a column of numbers with the intensity of someone explaining a discovery. Dorothea was leaning in with an expression that Lydia recognized, the expression of a person encountering data that confirmed something they'd believed but hadn't been able to prove. She thought about what came next. The claim would be filed. Creel's inquiry would run into a prior valid claim, and, with no standing debt connected to the basin land itself, the debt was on the Danner property, not on land she'd homesteaded independently, it would find no purchase. A territorial land lawyer had confirmed this in a note Mr. Marsh had summarized for her. A homestead claim by the wife of an abscondent debtor was legally independent of the husband's obligations, provided the land was not the asset used as security. The Danner property was the security. The basin was new. It would not be smooth. There would be correspondence and possibly direct contact from Creel's representative. There might be an argument about the nature of the occupancy or the validity of the claim. These were things that could be worked through because she now had a notarized claim on record, a lawyer, a merchant with a commercial interest in her stability, a postmaster who was not an adversary, and a school teacher who had offered his materials. She had spent 2 months building something invisible and had ended up building something real. The cheese on the aging shelf at the basin was 2 weeks from peak condition on the newest rounds. She was going to need another trade delivery by Friday to keep Mr. Marsh supplied. She had a new variety she'd been experimenting with, a softer style, washed in brine, that had a more complex flavor than the hard cheese, that was not quite ready but would be interesting when it was. The basin's spring ran warm through summer and into fall, which meant she had a longer season than any valley operation below. She had been thinking, in spare moments, about how to use the fall window, a time when other dairy operations were winding down and the market for preserved and aged dairy goods was typically strong before winter. She was thinking, she realized, like someone planning for a future rather than surviving a present. She picked up her notarized document and folded it into her coat, next to the space where Creel's letter had been, and noted the different weight of them. Creel's letter had arrived as a threat and sat in her pocket like a stone. The notarized claim felt like something else entirely. "Mabel," she said, "when you're finished, We should start back before the light changes. Mabel looked up. She and Dorothea exchanged a look that contained several things that did not need to be said aloud. The specific communication of two people who have become friends through paper and are meeting in person for the first time and finding that the paper told the truth. "Can Dorothea come to the basin?" Mabel asked. "Not today, but sometime?" Lydia thought about this. The basin would not be a secret much longer. The claim filing would establish its existence legally, and the trade network already implied it to anyone who thought carefully. And there was something she liked about the idea of the phenology project being conducted by both researchers at both sites. "Yes," she said, "sometime, if her father is agreeable." Dorothea looked at her father. Mr. Marsh nodded once, briefly, in the manner of a man who had already considered the question and found it acceptable. "Then sometime," Mabel said, satisfied, and closed her notebook with the precise care she gave to things she intended to come back to. June arrived in the Fernwater Basin 3.5 weeks before it arrived anywhere else in the Clearwater country, as it did every year and would continue to do for as long as the deep thermal spring pushed its warmth up through the limestone shelf and spread it in silver threads across the basin floor. Lydia stood at the spring source in the early morning with a cup of coffee and watched the goats work the far pasture. The steam came up from the wettest ground near the source and drifted sideways in the cool air. The aging shelf in the hollow held 22 rounds in various stages: hard cheese, soft cheese, the new washed rind variety that Mr. Marsh had now sold to 3 customers in advance of its readiness, which was the kind of commercial enthusiasm she found both flattering and slightly alarming. The homestead claim was on record in the Lewiston Land Office. The confirmation had arrived through Mr. Cole's post office, exactly as he'd promised. He had brought it to the hollow log himself, leaving it with a brief note in his own hand that said only, "Filed and confirmed, effective from notarization date. Congratulations." She had pinned the confirmation to the inside of the cabin wall, next to Mabel's phenology chart and a pressed flower from the first bloom Mabel had recorded in the basin's peculiar early spring. Creel's agent had sent a formal inquiry to Tolliver and received a formal reply. There had been no further correspondence. She did not expect there would be, though she remained attentive. Mabel came out of the cabin with her notebook under her arm and stood beside her mother at the spring. 52.1, she said, reporting the morning temperature without being asked. "A little cool," Lydia said. "Still warm for June at this elevation." Mabel opened her notebook to the chart. Dorothea's reading for yesterday was 48.6. We're still about a month ahead. "That's what we're counting on," Lydia said. Mabel looked at the basin with the systematic attention she gave everything: the goats, the grass, the water running bright in the morning light, the ridge lines above still holding a remnant of snow on the shaded north faces. She looked at it the way she looked at her notebook pages, starting at the edges and working inward, finding the structure. "It knows what it's doing," she said. Same words she'd used on the day they arrived, descending through the last of the timber with the mule and the goats and the slatted crate. Lydia looked at her daughter, then at the basin. "So do we," she said. The spring ran on. The cheese aged on its shelf in the cool hollow. The basin greened into June, while the country around it was still in the tentative, cautious hold of a late spring that hadn't fully decided to let go. And at the hollow log on the old timber trail by the wagon road, a folded note waited in the usual place. A letter from Dorothea to Mabel, containing the latest phonology readings from the valley, and at the bottom, in a careful and hopeful hand, "Father says I may visit on the last Saturday of the month, if the weather holds." It would hold. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you liked the story. If so, please consider giving the video a hype and writing a comment where you are watching from. Your support means a lot to me. See you in the next video.